Suffice to say, I was fangirling his work and was sharing about him and his work with other colleagues. And then we decided for this Mountaintop, particularly with the topic of imagining biodiverse futures and weaving living stories, we thought the counter map had to be part of that. So which is why Cian is here, and he, despite being super busy and a dad running around after his kids, which I found was the case over the weekend as I was trying to reach him, he's here with us today. So welcome, Cian, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Cynthia. It's good to have my face and voice there. I wish I was there with you guys. I guess I'm just gonna do um share like a general outline or like a roadmap on how to look at maps or understand understand maps, like a map of maps, but from my version, um, and try to sort of like interrogate the map in different frequencies, how we understand space, but then like particularly on the word map, how do we sort of perceive this word like as a as an image or images, or a noun versus like map as a verb, um, and then our understanding of placeness, and our location and positionality, not just within space but also within our conditions in society. So this presentation entitled Against the Map has been sort of like reiterated a number of times to groups relatively similar to you guys, I guess, like sometimes students, sometimes high school, sometimes different age groups of different professions and backgrounds. Um, I'm also been doing this counter mapping workshops with different marginalized communities here in the Philippines, particularly from farmer groups or peasant groups and indigenous communities. So yeah, a while ago, I'm not sure how many of you sort of got the chance to think through some of the questions that I passed on to Cynthia last night, but then um, instead of maybe like introducing ourselves or yourselves, um, I was sort of like thinking if you could start by thinking through the questions of like where you grew up, like how would you describe the spaces and places of your childhood? What were the things that you noticed back then as you were growing up, and how it influenced? How were the things that you noticed influenced your perspectives now? If you consider yourselves grown up at all, maybe not. There's no wrong and right answer there. And then pretty much like how we sort of situate ourselves within the conditions relating to the things we notice on the spaces that we grew up in, or where we live and work, or the spaces we inhabit now. So, so since there's a lot of us, like, and I guess like if you've had the chance to think through those questions, it's just pretty much like a primer on like how we can get started into thinking about these things. For my part, like if I was to sort of ask myself those questions, maybe like I can introduce myself like very quickly. My name is Cian, and I grew up in our family house in a gated village in Metro Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines. So Manila, has been getting tighter throughout the years as more people are trying to find jobs in the city because of lack of development in the countryside, basically. And then within the gaps outside the gated villages, there are business districts and commercial and mixed use and public areas. Um, Within all of those are also informal settlements. So it's quite easy to identify social stratification and unequal distribution of resources and services, such as public housing, healthcare, education. So now, having a family, I moved to another village, but just outside the city a little bit. So it's more suburban or peri-urban. The air is a little bit cleaner. The village was developed about 3 to 4 decades ago by a private real estate firm. When we moved here almost 10 years ago, there was a lot of empty green spaces, as originally the area was used for agriculture. But then it's also like near the lake and other things. So it's basically the plains at the foothills of this large mountain range. Um, but then near the lake, um, but now it's more of like a middle class suburbia as economy sort of like expanded from the city in the form of private development, basically. Thus sort of also pushing local food and like production further away from the city as the government favors imported goods, basically. So this is how I would sort of quickly, I mean, like like I've obviously like thought of it. Like I've had more than a few minutes to think about these things. And I've like internalized it over and over again. And then on most, like I guess like on other days, like I could be more like poetic about it, and a lot less straightforward. But I guess like for this morning, this is just how it came up, no? So I just wanted to send you these questions prior to today's talk so that you can start thinking through the questions of, and in doing so, connect the ideas of like who we are or where are we and where do we belong? How do we belong? How do we locate ourselves within society? And in a way, these questions are what we're trying to answer this morning by making and unmaking maps or trying to go against the maps. So yeah, basically what are maps, no? Like, and where do we find them and where do we use them nowadays? Throughout the history no, of cartography, um, so cartographies or maps have always like served ideological or political or scientific or military functions. They've been created and used by like centralized bodies such as states or corporations or institutions. And what they do is they disseminate information and enforce notions such as territory, ownership, statehood, like among other like big ideas. No? So essentially, maps or cartographies are tools of power and influence. And as they become objects to which how people understand the world and then the environment and how people control resources and how people get from one place to another, navigating. No? So entire populations basically and ecosystems are subject to these ideas inscribed within the things that we call maps. And what is known, what is controlled, what is contained are all laid out in an inanimate object and regarded as truth. So thus maps have been or have become tools, like I said, of centralized bodies to exercise power, crafted to justify various acts from exploration to exploitation. But when you pay too much attention to the dominant boundaries and categories, you tend to forget to look at the bigger picture. And then all the maps can be weaponized. As they chart projections of space and place, they also hide entire networks of reality. While showing us a prescribed view of the world, they also control how we move and how we think. They not only inform, but they also impose. So maps usually offer a vertical perspective, no, top to down. This view tends to make its readers believe that they are omniscient, omnipresent, that they will see with God's eyes. But what happens when the readers can't find themselves in the maps? What happens when we can't find ourselves in the map? It can be argued then that maps are somewhat of an unnatural way on how to view the world. So take for example these images, no, the Mercator projection, which was sometime in the 15th century. It's most commonly used. It's actually the most commonly used projection in world maps up to this day. Originally produced to aid voyages traveling from one part of the globe to the other, but greatly distorts the sizes of the land masses. So these distortions have harsh implications to how people view themselves and others, especially to developing countries such as ours. Racial superiority and colonialism are effects that could be attributed to these distorted views. So we see the Mercator projection on the upper left, the Gals Peters projection on the upper right, and the Robinson's projection on the lower left. So other projections, as you see here, um, have been developed to address the distortions caused by the Mercator projection, the one on the upper left. But its effects may take longer to undo, actually. And then there are also other projections of the land masses and the waters and the oceans that have been developed and used for other purposes. The Dymaxion map above of the Buckminster Fuller presents the continents as continuous land masses. No? And here we see like the Imago Mundi, the image of the world, Neo-Babylonian, circa like 6th century BC or so. And then also the Jain cosmological map of the mortal world from India, 18th century. So maps such as these incorporate cosmologies and belief systems in the representation of space. The spiritual world, the spiritual world is just as important as the physical world, and they are viewed in the same plane. And then here are some examples, as other examples from a different perspective. One is a general chart of the integrated world. It's from the 1400s. It's a map attributed to Zhang He of China. And then another one to the right is a Chinese map of the South China Sea, um, or what some or may recognize as South China Sea. But it was developed in 1946, and it's actually showing the nine dash line. This is the one to the right. So these two maps basically illustrate how the author's perspective is always central to the map. You know, the Zhenghe map puts China at the center of the 1940s map. Um, and then the Zhenghe map puts China at the center of their known world. And the 1940s map highlights Chinese territorial claim to 90% of the sea. In the Philippines, we refer to it as West Philippine Sea. So yeah, there's like these are examples of when the authors put themselves in the middle, which is like totally understandable, but then how far will you take it and how inclusive do you represent the spaces that you actually co-inhabit with other people? So there are also maps that can show idealized landscapes and utopias. No? We can also see this more often in urban planning and land use plans. So Thomas More's Utopia, idealized world, and also Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, which is a conceptual plan for an imagined city where land use is strategically placed with agriculture, industry, and other forces of optimal living. Such is an example of central place theory, which can also be seen as overly deterministic, as it superimposes an idea based solely on civilization while ignoring the actual geology and nature, which leads us to this ideas of uh, idealized landscapes, no, like fantasy lands and real estate. So these are also portrayed in the marketing materials of development projects. It shows us how maps can visualize not just what is already there, but what is planned, but at what cost. are these projections of idealized spaces. The material we are looking at now is about this project called New Clark City, like north of Manila. It seems promising and something to look forward to, but there is no mention anywhere that this project will displace up to 20,000 families of farmers and indigenous communities, or that it will flatten entire mountain ranges in the region. So this larger idea of development aggression, like actual aggression that happens um, beneath um, projects of development. So development aggression is a term referring to state and or private funded development projects that displace communities and actually violate human rights. So these may be real estate developments, infrastructure projects, commercial or any other project, land-based project that was done without properly consulting settlers or totally excluding original inhabitants, putting profit over people. We can think about the development of modern cartography. Um, we can see it alongside the development of navigation. We can see it alongside the development of seafaring, and at the same time, gunpowder and warfare, and also the idea of the printing press, which was very crucial and pivotal into spreading the influence using cheap, reproducible material. Another anecdote, we're seeing here the map that is also known as the London cholera map, which was done in 1850s by the Dr. John Snow. So they were having a cholera outbreak in London, and then they collected locations of cholera patients and put the information in one map. So this helped the doctors find the source of the virus, which was actually a dirty pump to address the problem. So this map and then this event also somehow inspired the development of GIS or Geographic Information System, wherein spatial data is collected, organized, and visualized to make infographic maps. Visualizing space and using it into inscribing information becomes a way to solve problems, but also maybe create problems. We're seeing here some image that may be um, familiar to some of you, but then one common thread within these images is that they use GPS, the Global Positioning System. I guess the darker side of GPS and its different applications now is that it's a technology um like behind it, it's a technology using satellites that provide the geolocation and time information into any device that has a GPS receiver. So we usually have this on our smartphones for navigation, apps, and games. But this technology was owned and developed by the US Space Force for surveillance and production of smart bombs and precision guided munition. So not until like the 1990s was it sort of like used by the private sector, namely Google, to use the satellite image from surveillance to everyday uses. But then it's still within the private sector, so there's a lot of conversation still behind that. Here are three images that show similar things but in different sort of frequencies. So one's like a topographical map from NAMRIA, the National Mapping Authority in the Philippines. So like a topographical map showing the different levels. And then another one is a seafloor mapping, which is also technology developed by or largely developed by the US Navy. For what reasons, we can only speculate. And then another one is a wooden Inuit coastal map from Greenland. There's no other, I guess, like artifacts similar to it. So the people who are studying these pieces have also hypothesized or speculated that it's a one-off object and was used by the original owner more for storytelling than actual navigation. Um, but it shows the shape of the coast in its tactility. So these three maps show different ways or methods on how the physical features of the Earth is actually represented. No? The intent, however, varies depending on who uses or who develops and who makes the maps. Like for these samples, so these are different like thematic maps of Central Luzon region, but then they were part of a U.S. field map of the Philippines um, at 1945. So this was at wartime actually when Philippines and Japan were fighting on Philippine grounds. So the production of maps are commonly done by scientific and military institutions, like I said a while ago. But these maps of Central Luzon were used by American soldiers as they maneuvered through the rough terrain of the Zambales mountain range. And then, like towards the end of this sort of like enumeration, we have the historical maps um, of antiquity. So like these historical maps have also been somehow used for current geopolitical tensions, as these objects are not just pretty much bearers of heritage and cultural information, but also historical claims of nation states. So the map that we're looking at, the Murillo Velarde map, one is from 1734, one from 1744. This is actually the first comprehensive map charting the seas, the land, the flora, the fauna, and the people of the Philippine archipelago. It was commissioned by the Spanish crown as a survey on its new colonial subject. But other than its historical value, the remaining copies of these maps are highly sought after because of the inclusion of the Panatag Shoal. You can see it on the like leftmost part of the map area. So the Panatag Shoal is a highly disputed land feature in the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea. So how do we feel about like important historical artifacts being sold at auctions to the highest bidder? So I guess like the images and then that um the quick enumeration of maps or like examples of like cartographs and perspectives on maps or like an initial way or entry point into how we can maybe understand maps. You guys probably from your own experience and backgrounds may have other ideas on examples and perspectives on how we've experienced maps at this day and age. But then I guess like from these different collected ideas, like I kind of want to I mean I want to talk about the idea of counter mapping and then how we can actually go against um, these maps that just portray like dominant perspectives and actually exclude the people or like us within um, their omnipresent voices. So what is counter mapping? No? It's a practice of producing maps which counter the dominant perspectives imposed by positions of power. Yeah, it counters the dominant narratives imposed by positions of power. So these counter maps include maps that were made by no, so positions of power, meaning maps that were um, made by institutionalized, professionalized cartographic houses working for the state or large corporations. Like so, in broader terms, counter mapping or counter cartography counters or goes against the dominant narratives from oppressive power structures. And in doing so, counter mapping aims to further more progressive and pro people agendas. It recognizes the idea that maps were never neutral or value-free images. No, the term is actually coined by Nancy Peluso, Canadian geographer in 1995, who argues that the technique gives communities the power to control their own representation and elaborately describe the resources and their use in everyday life. So when Nancy Peluso coined the term in 1995, she was actually conducting counter mapping, mapping research with land disputes of indigenous communities in Indonesia. So I mean, like we can actually add that little anecdote or that little texture that it came from, like at least within the region. No? Um, yeah. So counter mapping, like, in different terms, is also like a reversal or a subversion of the state practiced uh, of of the state practiced boundary making and the cartographic gaze. So it's like the turning around of that cartographic dominant gaze. It can also be a form of resistance, as it can be used to expose rights violations, displacement, harassments, aggression, and structural violence. It can also be used to present space based on everyday shared experiences of a community and ultimately articulate collective aspirations of a shared space, which at this day and age may be deemed subversive. Countermapping is mapping from the ground on the ground and not from an elitist authoritative position. And but then we can also recognize and come to realize that the ground is in fact a position of authority. So I'm showing you here some examples of some of my work within the past couple of years that also respond to the format of the Murillo Velarde map. Maybe they're also like artistic subversions of the map, not just in form, not just in image, but also in context. So this particular map that we're looking at right now is a map of, I mean, the English translation of the title is Map of what is now known as the Philippines. It talks about the Spanish colonial history of the Philippines from the perspective of the Filipino. So the pre-Katipunan or early anti-colonial revolts and early ecclesiastical establishments are plotted out in the map, while images of and with annotations of specific scenes from the 300-year colonization are portrayed within the side panels. Another example of a subversion of the Murillo Velarde map is his work from 2020 entitled Tropical Terror Tapestry. So it's basically also a survey of militarism within the Duterte regime, using reports and statements from alternative media, human rights groups, people's organizations, and different individuals. The work maps out the experiences of aggression and impunity perpetrated by state forces. Different methods of aggression are portrayed in the side panels where military bases are plotted in the map. And then as you can see in the details, QR code patches are also used in both works as hyperlinks leading to leading the viewer to related content such as articles, videos, and other sources here. So other examples of maps or like like work that I did, mostly as you can see is actually based on textile. And the reason why I make textile maps or tapestry maps is like I guess like the more base and primary um conceptual backdrop of my working with tapestry is that it also somehow responds to and subverts the materiality of European feudal tapestries. Basically, they're large, majestic, nomadic murals that are portraying private property and territory. So, with my work coming from a more anti-feudal and anti-imperialist perspective, like I'm making these maps that actually expose the systemic oppression and the aggression that is perpetrated by state and corporations. So in this map that we are looking at now, same you see QR codes with related links, but it's showing the region in northern Philippines, which is like a mountain range. Um, and then I am here plotting um, different like aggressive development projects such as like dams and other energy infrastructures that displace indigenous communities and also large scale mining tenements within the region. So the different icons and the different drawings are also inspired by the drawings of community members that are also participants in the workshops that I do with them. So here's another one in the Central Luzon, which is just south of Cordillera region. And then here, similarly, it shows like military presence and development aggression projects, mining tenements, but also here showing the largest land holdings um, amidst peasant landlessness and Chinese land grabs. So like, I guess like sometimes it's a clear view to look at spaces through the contradictions that are happening within the spaces. So, speaking of peasant landlessness, one such example of a infographic counter map that is done by Ibon Foundation, which is like an economic and political think tank, is showing here largest land holdings amidst peasant landlessness. So, just a quick primer for context. The Philippines, where most of the population, I guess, like at least theoretically, is within the peasant sector, which means they are involved in food production and working the land. And theoretically, 7 out of 10 of these farmers are landless, which means they work lands that are private land holdings by elite land-owning oligarchs or multinational corporations. So the infographic map you're seeing at the left is showing like where the highest of where that contradiction, where that contrast is more stark. You know, I mean, how big can a private uh, can a private corporation or like a family can own a piece of land while having like most of the population um, as a landless workers. So the idea of land reform is a highly disputed topic within the history of the Philippines, but I'm sure also in the rest of the region and the rest of the global south. Another example on the right is a very recent work done by some geographer colleagues of mine, wherein they map the different mining tenements of the Philippines. So here it's saying that they didn't need to make a base map of the Philippines to recognize that it is already get the shape of the Philippine archipelago just by looking at the mining tenements. So this is past, existing, and proposed, meaning like mining tenements that are just under exploration. But then I guess with the mining issue of the Philippines and the rest of the region of Southeast Asia, um, we may all know that our lands are very mineral rich considering our geology and our place in the tropics. Especially that we are within the Pacific Ring of Fire. So our lands are very fertile and very mineral rich, and we have so much mineral, like very basic minerals like copper, nickel, among others, more than enough to industrialize many times over. But then none of our minerals actually go to us. They are just mined and extracted from our lands, but they go to different um, foreign countries, as the mining companies are actually multinational companies. So this is because of the neoliberal policies that allow this to happen. So I'm showing you, I guess, like these are examples of maps that were made by um, uh, colleagues and civil society groups within the Philippines, alongside my own work as a visual artist who talks about notions of space and power. So I guess like the bigger question in terms of myself and how I incorporate my artistic practice with this kind of research and my involvement within different activist groups and my positionality as well, being an activist and also a student of geography myself. So since 2017, actually, another way of looking at that year is that it was also like the sort of the start of the Duterte regime, no? So I was thinking of ways on how I could sort of deepen or expand my research practice um, in relation to my artistic practice. So since that time, I've been conducting small mapping workshops basically. So these are very informal drawing and group discussion sessions done in protest camps, communities, festivals, or small intimate gatherings. The participants of these workshops come from various sectors such as the peasants, factory workers, indigenous minorities, and urban poor, all of which they bear the brunt of oppression and the repression perpetrated by the state and all the abusive corporations. So in these workshops, the personal experiences of the people are actually mapped, or they are encouraged to map out the personal experiences, as opposed to the dominant narratives as projected by positions of power that we can see in state maps, in corporate maps, in road maps and tourist maps and whatnot. No, so this particular method uses basic materials, minimal tech, if any, and just takes a few hours, or they can take it home, then come back to it, or whatever. Uh, so the maps produced in these workshops that I've been conducting since that time, in this method of counter mapping, these are raw and intimate, like objects, and then they actually also try to be more direct artifacts of personal narratives and statements which are invaluable to obtaining a holistic understanding to events in a given space, no? So like we can have people do like come in with the GPS gadgets and do surveys of satellite images and whatnot, but then it's more of like the cognitive aspect of it, the more psychosocial aspect of it. I mean, the social justice aspect of these methods are what we are trying to sort of intertwine and put together in a in a workshop scenario. Yeah, so looking into the emotion, for example, and the affect within the social conditions of the people, the method or the workshop follows the definition of definition and function of countermapping as a tool for basically waging a revolution that is activated by its users to shape a progressively just society, and is defined by equity, social justice, and human rights. So with it, the workshop is actually, I mean, like any other cognitive mapping workshop, but then it's backed or anchored on the ethos of social justice and equity and human rights. So here I'm showing you some examples of maps that were done by different practitioners. I mean, like since I started, like I've documented like a couple of hundred, but then I'm just showing you some. Um, I usually encourage the participants to write their statements or label or annotate their drawings using their vernacular. And then with their permission also, I document the work so that it just sort of goes into this larger archive. Um, it's not always the case because sometimes when I do it with groups such as today or high school students, like I don't really ask permission to document the work. But then on some cases also, especially that the participants of these communities who are undergoing, who are sort of in the middle of the struggle of land disputes, of human rights violations, of state oppression, um, most of the time or all of the time, they're also doing or presenting like vulnerable narratives. So um, if I do if I do get documentation, I will have to like cross out their names if the works were to be published or included in an exhibition. Yeah, so here, for example, we're seeing a map that wherein central is the river, and then in this river, the author of this map is a chieftain from one of the indigenous communities, and then the issue there is like the government is wanting to build a large dam. Um, large dam in itself is a development aggression issue because it is a very big contradiction, these large dams. The engineering of it, its structure, its lifespan is only 50 years. It will provide energy and water, but then it's privatized because it's economically expensive to build. Thus, a country such as ours will have to loan money from a bigger country, and then the debt like will be paid for more than 40 more than its lifespan, and then its actual ecological impact is far more worse than its economic benefits of supplying water and electricity to big cities that are getting more and more populated because of imbalance within the social and economic structures of rural and urban dynamics. So this whole big, intricate, and complex issue is sort of manifested within the large dam as this monument of inequality and neoliberal dynamics. So I guess I can just end the lecture and then we can like have a conversation, and then we can also opt to talk about how you guys can possibly um, do the workshop within your own time after this hour. I think I've been speaking for I don't know 40 minutes or something, but so yeah, so that's the presentation. And start the conversation also, I mean, like, so I introduced myself based on like my response to my own questions on like where I grew up and where I live now. I guess a little bit of a background, like I'm coming at a lot of things as a visual artist. I've been practicing and showing, I guess, or I approach things as like a visual as an artistic or like a cultural, from a cultural work perspective. I guess that's like a base positionality. Um, and I guess like to sort of like envelope the positionality of visual artists, there's also like the layer of activist and academic. Activist in the sense that like I'm also involved within various organizations that are for social justice and human rights, particularly within like the peasant sector and indigenous people sector. Um, and I'm also like I'm also in grad school. I'm studying geography now. So when I started doing this, I'm not like approaching it on a very academic. It's not until now that I'm trying to slowly structure the workshop, the presentation, the social practice side of the art practice as a more structured and somehow slightly theorized practice of counter mapping and going against them and challenging notions of like dominant perspectives. So yeah, I guess like more than anything, like I said, like I'm trying to approach it on a more um cultural work lens.
My name is Neville. I'm also involved in mapping, but we don't call it counter mapping here. But you can count it as counter mapping. But for us here, Sabah, I think it's mainly using a colonial tool against oppressor. If I say it in a very um, way of, I mean, to say it in a way that that you've been oppressed and you want to fight the oppressor, right? But now in this last decade, it's more about using those tools strategically so that the communities can advocate for their rights and having that recognized. In terms of artwork, it's something very new. I think maybe what a lot of mapping practitioners here in Sabah do is a form of art, but people just don't call it art. And it's all over Sabah actually. I mean, all over Borneo or Malaysia also. Indigenous people's issue is in the Philippines is quite something that I think Malaysia also share in common. Not just Malaysia and Philippines, but globally. So yes, mapping or counter mapping is a very effective colonial tool.
Papa, can
Huh?
I see fish?
Yeah, can. So not a question, just like immediate response from me.
Actually, yeah, you raised some really, really interesting points. First, like on how we label what we do. So if you like counter mapping specifically, is somehow anchored on um the historicizing of such a practice. I mean, basically, um, the geographers sort of just put a name to what's already been being done within the grassroots. Um, so if we look at mapping as a solely like Western or global North or like a dominant tool, um, and the grassroots or the more militant use of it is already a subversion. I guess it also sort of goes on to the question of semiotics, or like how do people in general really understand space anyway. Is a flat map a flat map a universal way on how we um represent space? So like with its different possible names or nicknames: counter mapping, counter cartography, cartography otherwise, participatory mapping, community mapping, um all of these different terminologies may have like very, very similar uses. And if anything, I think the more like the most important thing in terms of looking into the labels in which we um, call different practices is like on how we reference existing uses of it. So I guess like when you say counter mapping, it's sort of like already references to more established or more written about practices of mapping. But then when we also say like written about or historicized, do we only mean that in the English speaking world, the English speaking like academic geographic world? Because there's so much being done that's not within the radar of academia. And that's what should be more highlighted more, what we're doing on the ground, on the grassroots. And regardless of what we call it, I mean like participatory mapping, community mapping, and in different languages. It may not always be within the format of pieces of paper or like or large pieces of paper drawn together. Some may be in the forms of dance, some may be in the forms of oral tradition, and and other things. It just so happened that like in how I'm adapting it, like I'm using the format of a small piece of paper and then done by individuals or small pairs, so that like it's somewhat of a controlled format that can be shared to other communities, and then maybe they can read it as well, if not understand the written language, somehow immersed within the visuals that were drawn. So like, I mean, even if you don't understand what's written in one of the maps, you understand that there's a river, there's a mountain, there's a house, and then there's a bulldozer, for example. And then like somehow you understand the story. And then if anything, that's what I ask of the participants, is to tell their stories in a visual way. And although it's an individual um practice or activity, it's somehow encouraged that the participants draw from the perspective of a shared condition of the community. So where do we get our food? Where do we get our water, instead of where do I get our water? Or why do I get water? Where do I get food? So there's that shift from perspective of individual to community. And also in response to it being art, I guess there's always a lot of pros and cons um, to the extra added context of art, especially now, especially if you start talking about or through the context of contemporary art and all its given platforms. So, for example, when you say contemporary art from Southeast Asia or from the global South, it already has a ring to it within the world like the Biennale circuit or the museum circuit or commercial galleries wanting to make money out of of nice things that were made out of the sad stories of marginalized population. So there is that big contradiction that we're constantly fighting or constantly facing. Even as myself, when I introduced myself as a visual artist, that is also a very tricky um, that's a very tricky position because like when I face a community, when I go to a community, there always is that question so are you gonna make something like are you gonna make a painting out of our life problems and then are you gonna sell it in a gallery? So there's always that contradiction which can be answered in different ways in different contexts. And it's up to how everyone, like the respondent community, the artists, the collaborators, on how to keep grounded within these realities and contradictions. I mean, because um when we go into a community that we do not belong to, we are already affecting their time and then how they respond to their own issues as we ask them or encourage them to ask. We are recognizably extracting very, very sensitive and vulnerable uh, life stories, which we are turning into presentations and artworks. And then so it's not the answer is not to just stop. The answer is like to keep asking ourselves, how do we give justice to these stories? And then to maintain the criticality within our own positionality. So yeah, I mean, I'll always be like like a middle class kid based in the city, but I always talk about the issues of the rural, of the peasantry, of the indigenous, and um, how I choose to be in solidarity from my studio to my time in the field, and vice versa. That is the everyday thing. So yeah, I guess that's my response to two of the points that you had pointed out about like what we call the mapping and like the art side of it.
My my question is probably I'm seeking for advice because I do a bit of social mapping myself. And how do you reproduce? I see it's like tapestry, embroidery, um, all these works that are very tedious. Do you make copies of it, or is it like one of ones? And my next question, I mean, how do you make these things? Do you work with a community? Do you make it yourself, or how? The next question is we Bornean olden religion. We have shamanism. We have our old our tribal roots, and a lot of things that are unseen in I mean visually, and we can only I mean it's only depicted by this dying culture that is uh, in our crafts. So my question is how, I mean, if you have an answer to this, or some kind of an advice, how do I um, show this unseen? I mean, because we have gods and goddesses, we have all these spiritual beings that are uh, told through oral stories, and we can only imagine. But I don't want to have like a visual representation that is misleading. So in a very visual way that you're doing, how do you overcome this? How do you, is it like just a verbal or written story, or do you somehow show something?
And thank you for asking those because like those are the things that I always tend to forget to talk about whenever I talk. I mean, like deliver this presentation. It's always like what the work is talking about, but not exactly about the work. So yeah, thanks again for those two questions. So correct me if I'm wrong. Like the first one is asking about like the object or the materiality of the work, how I make it, and in what context of collaboration do I make them, and where do they go, etc. Right. So responding to that, the textile pieces themselves. So before the work before any work that happens within the studio, the art studio, I guess it's a lot of like immersing in different stories, stories that are most often um, untold, silenced, actually deliberately silenced by um, dominant frequencies of knowledge production, such as like mainstream media or government propaganda. So what I'm saying is, a lot of the stories that I'm getting from, if not the communities themselves, um, mass organizations or people's organizations that are working closely with the communities and are somehow ideologically aligned with myself, which is very much critical um, to status quo and takes the positionality of like an anti-feudal, anti-imperialist, and anti-fascist uh, anti-fascist perspective. So I am basing it on um, whoever's voice that champions social justice and human rights coming from the ground. I guess like that's how I would explain it on in a very very general perspective. So also that means I subscribe to a lot of alternative media. Um, the I mean not like alternative media of like grassroots journalism, which actually is um, a part of or community-based organizing and human rights watch groups. So these are the groups that I sort of go to connect me to different communities, and these are the groups who also help the communities build campaigns so that it's like a um, collectively articulated um, um, issue that is also more that offers a more analytical and guided view on how to address issues on the ground in relation to larger things like policy and global policy. So, for example, the conversation about agriculture and monocrop plantation and its effect on environment because of the dependence to agrochemical agrochemical use, synthetic fertilizer, its health hazards, its ecological hazards. So these are different anecdotes that you would get from one, peasant groups, two, environmental groups, three, progressive scientists, four, like alternative media that talks about these things, five, like soil and seed advocates and food advocates. So those are like avenues on where like I sort of get the stories. And then from the stories, I just pretty much digest it, digest this like wealth of anecdotes, and as an individual, digest it. How do I understand all of these things? And basically, they start out with little sketches, like okay, I'll make a map of what I'm talking about because usually I make maps not as like a spatial guide, but more of like an outline to understanding complex narratives within like a given context. No, so like it's all what I try to plot out in maps are interconnected ideas, more than spaces. And then they just come out looking at like maps or diagrams or timelines. No, so from there, like I make sketches, and then they become artworks by when I make the textile tapestries, I guess like pragmatic um part of studio practice is like I basically just draw with wax pencil or crayon on on a large piece of fabric that's stapled onto the wall. And then when I make the drawing there, like little by little, I pass it on to my collaborator who's an embroiderer. So I've been working with one embroiderer doing hand-guided embroidery. So like my drawings are there and then he traces it manually, but with a machine. So I've been working with that embroiderer for like a few years now, or since 2017 or 2016 or so. Only one guy. And then they actually have a little stall in the market. They do monograms for school uniforms and face towels, and then I just came in years back with a big fabric, and we started like working all together. So that's how, I mean, that's basically how the textile piece comes to life. I draw it and then we embroider it, and then I draw on it again, then we embroider it, and then like on occasions wherein I get to I during like in between that exchange between myself and the embroiderer, I also show it to different representatives of the community that I'm. So there's also like consulting, like, is this okay? Is this right? Is this framed right? Is the wording of my label okay? So as much as possible, there is that um, sense of like consulting, that I'm never the one who's fully authoring the work, but I'm co-authoring it with the perspectives of the organizations. So I guess my role as a visual artist is that I'm actually the conduit uh, to the stories of the people. Of course, it's my imagery, it's my color, it's my materiality, it's my framing, but more the backstory of it as much as possible. I am just the bridge into their stories. I am guilty of wanting to make like beautiful things out of the struggle of people, because there is that importance of the visceral qualities of a strong object that draws people in and then entraps them into immersing within the stories of these people, of us collectively, actually. In a way, the audience is supposed to relate to the narratives of the people themselves. These are made to look nice and fit more into a institutional platform, actually. I'm actually not too attached to the objects themselves, in terms of if they get into a private collection of some art collector or get acquired by a museum, because I look at the objects themselves as just a byproduct of the research and continuous consultation and collaboration with the communities, and that's the more important material that we've gathered. Now the question is like, what do we what do we make out of all of these stories, out of these folders in our computers of transcribed conversations, of related articles, of growing bibliographies and recorded material. So I guess like there's always that openness to make reiterations of one work, different like versions, like updated versions, and to eventually actually compile the research and pass it on to other artists or other researchers who may have use for it, the body of research material. So yeah, in my head, like um I'm always thinking about the documentation. Like, are these photographed well so I can like present them like on a different context? Or I can put them in a printed material so that they can be studied or experienced, at least the documentation of these things. There is the materiality of objects have very, very limited reach to audience. I mean, like if you make a textile piece, like how many people will actually get to experience it in person? 100, 1,000. Um, those are numbers, no? Yeah, about the imagery of I guess embedded embedded belief systems and how it sort of is visualized within our work. And so actually, like as a Filipino, I don't really connect to a lot of into my own indigenous or pre-colonial belief systems because it has been erased. So actually, not totally erased, but rather whitewashed. So a lot of our um, institutions, for example, and culture is very much based on the influence of Catholicism, because Spain introduced Christianity, and then it somehow intertwined within like the original animistic and shamanistic and folk practices. So it became some sort of folk Christian brand of Roman Catholic practice. But then, of course, we don't really see this thing like religion and faith practice as isolated things. It's also intertwined with our history as a colonial and post-colonial and neo-colonial people. Like class and social stratification is very much influential on how people are connected with their spirituality and faith. The church is still a big influence. Um, but then, like different applications to the conservatism of Christianity, but also to the liberatory um, potentialities of Jesus Christ as a revolutionary image, actually, which I am interested in. So that being said, I guess my own aesthetic and visual vocabulary has learned how to adapt into different modes of imagery and sort of like appropriate certain visual styles of different cultures of my own culture and sort of like subvert, like constantly like subvert and reappropriate and misappropriate and disappropriate the visuality of like Christianity, of indigenous culture, of far left ideology, of far right ideology, and the branding of authoritarian government, all of which put together is somewhat um, like the sum of my own imagery and that and how I understand the world, coming from a perspective of like I associate with global south more than I associate with folk Christian, which like I'm not a very religious person, but if anything, like I think my faith practice and belief system is based on the idea of human rights, if that counts. But then yeah, I guess like activism and advocacy and your beliefs in a society, in a better social um dynamic can actually be seen as a faith practice, no, somewhere you some ideology that you guide your everyday decisions to. And so how does that manifest into my artistic practice? Is that it just sort of like um immerses and envelopes itself within the contradictions and subjectivities, the politicized subjectivities of different perspectives. So, I mean, if you look at my work, for example, like maybe I can send you the PowerPoint so you can review some of the images. But then, if you look at some of my work, like the images, the drawings respond to um, the respective region that the map textiles are um, actually representing. So for example, it's coming from like the Cordillera region. Like some of my drawings take the form and style of Cordillera weaving. So it's kind of like a yeah, very adaptable, kind of chameleon-like sort of artistic visual language, which I encourage other people to somehow like try out actually. I mean, if anything, like we are when we speak to different people, our language sort of like adapts to it as well. So maybe it's the same thing with like making visual art or moving a certain way or speaking a certain way.